In history, there is a recurring pattern that has led to the downfall of three major governments over the past 250 years. France in 1789, Russia in 1917, and Cuba in 1959. These nations each experienced a rapid decline after periods of seeming stability. The model follows six distinct stages: extreme wealth inequality, government corruption and incompetence, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class, a loss of faith in institutions, a growing revolutionary movement, and finally the overthrow of the government leading to chaos. As of 2025, the United States is unmistakably in stage 4 of this pattern. The gap between the wealthiest Americans and everyone else is larger than ever. In fact, the top 1% now control 32% of the nation's wealth, a figure higher than at any point during the Gilded Age or the Roaring Twenties. Meanwhile, political corruption is rampant, with trust in institutions like Congress and the Supreme Court reaching all-time lows. Faith in the electoral system is shattered, as nearly half of Americans believe the 2020 election was stolen. As history shows, these patterns lead to revolutionary movements gaining mass support, and often chaos follows. France, Russia, and Cuba never saw their collapse coming, and each paid a catastrophic price. The lessons are clear: when inequality reaches extreme levels, governments fail to serve the people, and the middle class becomes disillusioned, revolutions are inevitable. America is now facing these same warning signs, and unless major reforms are made, it may be heading toward an uncertain future of unrest and upheaval. Let's start with the mother of all modern revolutions, France. The French Revolution of 1789 serves as a powerful example of how a nation's systemic problems can lead to catastrophic consequences, setting a template for the collapse of many future governments. The revolution unfolded in 6 stages, each one building upon the last, eventually leading to chaos and the complete overthrow of the old regime. Understanding these stages offers invaluable insights into the forces that can destabilize even the most powerful of nations. At the heart of the French Revolution was extreme wealth inequality, a condition that sparked outrage and unrest. In 1789, France had a population of 27 million people divided into 3 distinct estates: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, the common people. The wealth distribution was shockingly skewed. The first and second estates, consisting of just 1.5% of the population, controlled nearly 35% of the land and paid little to no taxes. Meanwhile, the remaining 98.5% of the population, which made up the third estate, owned just 65% of the land and bore the entire tax burden. This severe disparity in wealth was made all the more glaring by the stark contrast between the lavish lives of the nobility and the suffering of the peasantry. The third estate, which included peasants, workers, and the emerging middle class, felt the weight of these injustices. Peasants were forced to work the land owned by the nobility and were often subject to feudal dues. Meanwhile, urban workers in Paris struggled to make ends meet. In 1788, a bad harvest led to a spike in bread prices. Bread accounted for 88% of a peasant's budget, and as bread prices doubled, many could no longer afford to eat. The stark inequality between the aristocracy's grand feasts and the starving masses led to growing resentment, setting the stage for revolution. The French government, under King Louis XVI, was deeply corrupt and incompetent, exacerbating the social unrest. King Louis XVI, while not malicious, was widely regarded as weak and indecisive. His reign was marked by extravagant spending, unnecessary wars, and an inability to address the growing financial crisis facing the country. France had borrowed extensively to fund military campaigns, including aiding the American colonies in their fight for independence. By the late 1782s, the country was on the brink of bankruptcy. Louis's solution to the financial crisis was to impose higher taxes on the already burdened third estate. The nobility and the clergy, however, were exempt from paying taxes and resisted any attempt at reform. The king's inability to effectively address these issues was compounded by his unwillingness to challenge the privileges of the aristocracy. His reforms were blocked by the very groups whose support he needed. In 1789, Louis called the Estates General a representative assembly to address the fiscal crisis. However, this meeting, which had not occurred in over 170 years, would not go as he planned. The representatives of the Third Estate, frustrated by their lack of political power, would soon challenge the monarchy directly. As the financial situation worsened, the educated middle class, which included lawyers, merchants, and other professionals, became increasingly radicalized. This stage was crucial because revolutions do not typically begin with the poorest segments of society, but with the educated and middle-class groups who had expectations of a better life. These groups had been the backbone of French society, benefiting from the relative stability of the old regime, but as economic conditions worsened, they began to see that their futures were equally uncertain. Members of the Third Estate, particularly those who had received formal education, demanded equal representation in the Estates General. Under the old system, each estate had one vote, giving the nobility and clergy a 2-to-1 advantage over the Third Estate. The middle class, particularly those in the legal profession, began to demand that the Estates General be reformed into a national assembly where each representative would have a vote. When King Louis XVI refused to acknowledge this demand, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly and began meeting on its own. The radicals who led this movement began to see the monarchy as illegitimate, and this would be a pivotal moment in the revolution. When the National Assembly was locked out of their meeting place, they swore to meet until they had created a constitution marking the beginning of direct confrontation with the king. By 1789, the people of France had lost all faith in their political institutions. The monarchy, the church, and the courts had all lost their legitimacy. Louis XVI's attempt to maintain his absolute power only made matters worse. The Estates General had been convened to solve a financial crisis, but it had now become a platform for challenging the very foundation of the French monarchy. The National Assembly, which represented the common people, began to take matters into its own hands, and Paris was thrown into chaos. The calling of the Estates General and the subsequent formation of the National Assembly marked the first open defiance of royal authority. In July 1789, the storming of the Bastille, a symbol of royal oppression, further solidified the breakdown of the old system. The fortress, which had once been used to imprison political dissidents, was now the target of revolutionary fury. The fall of the Bastille symbolized the loss of power of the monarchy and signaled the beginning of a new era. As the revolution gained momentum, the radical Jacobin faction emerged as the most vocal and powerful group. Their calls for more extreme measures, including the execution of King Louis XVI and the redistribution of wealth, resonated with an increasingly desperate population. The Jacobins gained mass support because they promised to solve the crisis where the moderates had failed. The economy was still in turmoil, food remained scarce, and many were growing increasingly angry at the royal family's lavish lifestyle while the people starved. On the 21st of January 1793, King Louis XVI was publicly executed by guillotine. His death marked the point of no return for the revolution. The execution was not just symbolic, it signified the complete overthrow of the monarchy and the beginning of the Reign of Terror. The Jacobins, under leaders like Robespierre, began to purge anyone they considered an enemy of the revolution, leading to the deaths of thousands. The final stage of the French Revolution was the total collapse of the old order and the descent into chaos. The Reign of Terror lasted from 1793 to 1794, during which the Committee of Public Safety executed thousands of perceived enemies of the revolution. The guillotine became a symbol of this period, and public executions were carried out in large numbers. The radical nature of the revolution caused a significant breakdown in social order, with executions, purges, and internal strife becoming the norm. The chaos that ensued was so extreme that even the revolutionaries themselves were not immune. Robespierre, who had been one of the most fervent proponents of the terror, was eventually arrested and executed by the very system he had put in place. By 1799, France was exhausted both economically and politically. The revolution, which had begun with lofty ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, had led to mass violence, economic ruin, and political instability. It ended with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized power through a coup and established a military dictatorship that would rule Europe for the next 15 years. The French Revolution serves as a stark reminder of the dangers posed by extreme inequality, government incompetence, and the radicalization of the middle class. It shows how quickly a society can unravel when faith in institutions is lost, and when the ruling elite is unable or unwilling to address the grievances of the people. While the revolution began with promises of liberty and equality, it ultimately led to chaos and a new form of authoritarian rule under Napoleon. The lesson of France is clear: when the government fails to serve the people, and when the gap between the rich and the poor grows too wide, revolution becomes almost inevitable. Now let's jump forward 128 years. Russia, 1917, was a nation in deep crisis, much like other empires before it. The Russian Revolution was driven by long-standing issues of extreme wealth inequality, government corruption, and a complete failure to address the needs of the people. Under Tsar Nicholas II, the Russian Empire was deeply divided, with a small elite controlling most of the wealth, while the vast majority of the population lived in poverty. The wealth gap in Russia was staggering. In 1917, approximately 80% of the population were peasants, many of whom still worked under feudal-like conditions with little to no land of their own. The urban working class fared little better, enduring long hours and poor wages. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas II and the nobility enjoyed lavish lifestyles, living in opulence, while the rest of the country struggled to survive. This stark inequality fueled widespread discontent, as the people saw no hope for improvement under the existing system. Tsar Nicholas II was a weak ruler who failed to address the nation's problems. His government was plagued by corruption with the Tsar, and his court showing little concern for the suffering of the people. Despite Russia's disastrous involvement in World War I, which had already cost over 3 million lives by 1917, Nicholas continued to cling to autocratic rule without any significant reforms, His inability to address the country's dire economic situation, the food shortages, and the war effort's failure led to widespread frustration and anger. As the situation worsened, both the middle class and the military began to turn against the Tsarist regime. In February 1917, protests broke out in Petrograd Street, Petersburg, initially sparked by food shortages. When soldiers were sent to suppress the protests, many refused to fire on the crowds and instead joined them. This was a critical moment. With the military no longer loyal to the Tsar, his rule crumbled. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate on the 15th of March, 1917, ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. Following the abdication, the provisional government took over but failed to solve the country's problems. The government continued Russia's participation in World War I, which further alienated the people who were desperate for peace. The provisional government's inability to address basic needs like food and economic stability led to a loss of faith in its legitimacy. Amid this chaos, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party promised peace land and bread to the suffering masses. The Bolsheviks garnered significant support from workers, soldiers, and peasants who were fed up with the provisional government's failure to act. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks launched a successful coup, overthrowing the provisional government in what was largely a bloodless revolution. However, the ensuing civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-Bolshevik Whites resulted in immense suffering. The war claimed the lives of an estimated 10 million people and left the country in ruin. The lesson of Russia. The Russian Revolution, though rooted in legitimate grievances, serves as a cautionary tale. When extreme inequality, government corruption, and a failure to reform combine, the result can be catastrophic. The revolution promised liberation, but ultimately led to a brutal civil war and the rise of an even more oppressive regime. The lesson of Russia is clear: revolutionary movements may emerge from hope for change, but they often end in chaos and dictatorship. In the 1,950 seconds, Cuba was deeply divided by wealth. Havana, the capital, was a hub of luxury and excess, primarily benefiting from American tourism and mob-controlled casinos. However, the majority of Cuba's population, especially in rural areas, lived in dire poverty. The wealthiest 10% controlled over 70% of the country's wealth, while 80% of Cubans were peasants with little access to education, healthcare, or decent housing. This extreme disparity between the rich and poor created significant resentment, particularly in rural areas where living conditions were the harshest. Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power in a 1952 coup, ruled Cuba through corruption and violence. His regime was closely tied to American businesses, particularly those in casinos, sugar, and oil, which profited heavily from the Cuban economy. While Batista's elite supporters grew wealthier, the rest of the population suffered from government oppression. He used the military and police to suppress any opposition, which only fueled further discontent. The government was marked by its refusal to address the pressing issues of poverty and inequality. As Batista's reign became increasingly brutal, many in Cuba's educated middle class, who had initially been relatively supportive of the regime, began to radicalize. Fidel Castro, a wealthy lawyer, emerged as a leader when he decided to fight back against the government's violence. After a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, Castro's movement gained widespread attention. His message resonated with many Cubans, who were tired of living under a corrupt and oppressive system. Batista's continued repression, alongside the growing alienation of key sectors of Cuban society, led to a collapse in faith in the government. His use of violence to maintain control alienated both the Cuban people and international supporters. With the U.S. gradually withdrawing its support, Batista's regime lost legitimacy, paving the way for the revolutionary movement to gain mass support. Fidel Castro's guerrilla forces, initially small in number, gained significant traction in 1958. His promises of land reform and social justice attracted wide support from the urban working-class rural peasants, and even defecting military personnel. By the end of 1958, the Cuban military was collapsing, and Batista fled the country on the 1st of January 1959, marking the victory of the revolutionaries. After Batista's departure, Castro assumed power and quickly began consolidating control. Initially promising democratic reforms, Castro shifted toward an authoritarian regime, nationalizing industries and suppressing political opponents. His government implemented land reforms and other social programs, but the country soon experienced economic hardships. Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union and the subsequent repression of dissent marked the beginning of a new era of totalitarian rule. The Cuban Revolution shows that while revolutions may emerge from deep-seated social and economic problems, they often lead to new forms of oppression. Castro's revolution, which promised freedom and social justice, ultimately replaced one dictatorship with another. The lesson of Cuba is that revolutions can bring about significant change, but that change may not always lead to the hoped-for freedoms or prosperity. Let's break it down, because once you see it, you'll understand why what's happening in the United States right now should terrify you. The pattern of decline that has caused the collapse of empires and governments throughout history is repeating itself in America today. We are witnessing many of the same warning signs that have triggered revolutions and political upheaval in the past. From extreme wealth inequality to government corruption, a middle class under siege, and a loss of faith in institutions, the U.S. seems to be following the same trajectory as past empires. The problem is, history tells us how these stories end, and the warning signs are everywhere. One of the key indicators of impending societal collapse is extreme wealth inequality, and the United States is currently experiencing its most extreme wealth divide in history. In 1980, the top 1% of Americans controlled just 8% of the nation's wealth. Today, the top 1% controls 32% of the wealth. The top 0.1%, about 130,000, households now own more wealth than the bottom 90%, which consists of about 117 million households. The disparity between the wealthiest Americans and the rest of the population has never been larger. This level of inequality isn't just an economic issue, it is a fundamental social issue that undermines the principles of fairness and justice. It breeds resentment and creates a sense of hopelessness among those who see little opportunity to break free from poverty. The wealth concentration at the top doesn't just lead to economic stagnation, it also distorts the political landscape. The ultra-wealthy large corporations and financial institutions have an outsized influence on government decisions, pushing policies that benefit them while leaving the rest of the country to bear the burden. This growing wealth divide isn't just a statistic, it's a sign of a system that is failing to serve the needs of the majority. Just as empires in history began to fall when wealth became concentrated in the hands of a few, the United States is seeing a similar trend, one that threatens to destabilize the entire nation. Government corruption is another crucial factor in the collapse of nations, and it is increasingly a defining characteristic of the U.S. political system. Americans are witnessing a rise in corporate influence on politics, with politicians at all levels accepting massive campaign contributions from the wealthiest corporations. This system, often referred to as legalized bribery, allows corporations to effectively buy political influence, shaping policy in ways that benefit their interests while sidelining the needs of ordinary citizens. According to Open Secrets, in 2020 alone, political donations from corporate PACs amounted to over $5 billion, a clear indication of the disproportionate influence that corporations have on American politics. Corruption is not limited to campaign finance. The revolving door between government and big business has created a system where policymakers often serve the interests of the corporations they once regulated. For example, former executives of oil companies and Wall Street banks are routinely appointed to key positions in government, undermining the credibility of democratic institutions. This corporate capture of the government erodes public trust and leads to policies that prioritize corporate profits over the welfare of the people. The lack of transparency, accountability, and meaningful reforms in Washington is not just frustrating. It is a clear sign of a government that is no longer working for the people. The failure of government to address systemic issues such as poverty, healthcare, and education further fuels disillusionment. Voters increasingly feel that the system is rigged, that their voices no longer matter, and that the elite few have all the power. This breakdown in trust is a classic warning sign of a society on the brink of collapse. As the government becomes more corrupt and out of touch with the needs of its citizens, the stability of the nation is jeopardized. Stage 3, the middle class, is destroyed and radicalized. The middle class in the United States, long considered the backbone of the nation, is rapidly disappearing. In the post-World War II era, the middle class thrived. Wages were rising, the economy was growing, and a strong social safety net helped keep people from falling into poverty. But today, the middle class is shrinking, and its members are facing increasing economic hardships. According to the Federal Reserve, 40% of Americans do not have enough savings to cover a $400 emergency expense. More than half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck with little to no financial cushion. The lack of affordable health care, rising college tuition, and skyrocketing housing costs have pushed many members of the middle class into financial precarity. The gap between the rich and the middle class is widening. As financial insecurity grows, people are turning to radical solutions, driven by the frustration of being unable to achieve the economic success that was once possible. This is evidenced by the rise of populist movements on both the left and the right. In recent years, there has been growing support for policies such as Medicare for All on the left and nationalist anti-immigrant policies on the right. The radicalization of the middle class is not just about economic policy, it's also about the feeling that the political system is rigged. Many Americans now believe that the system works for the rich and powerful, but not for ordinary citizens. As a result, they are looking for alternatives, whether in the form of populist rhetoric or political extremism. This disillusionment with the system is a powerful motivator for change, but as history shows, it can also be the precursor to instability. One of the most dangerous signs of societal collapse is the erosion of trust in institutions. In the United States, trust in key institutions like the government, the judiciary, and the media has reached historically low levels. According to Gallup, only 20% of Americans have confidence in Congress, and trust in the media is similarly low. The FBI, once seen as a neutral body, is now viewed with suspicion by many, particularly after events like the investigation into the 2016 election and the handling of protests in 2020. This lack of faith in institutions is a direct consequence of years of corruption, failure, and partisanship. People no longer believe that institutions are working in the public interest. Instead, they view them as tools of the elite, serving only the rich and powerful. This skepticism is compounded by the rise of social media, which has fostered division and misinformation, making it harder for Americans to trust what they hear from the mainstream media or from political leaders. When people lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect their rights and maintain order, society becomes ripe for upheaval. As trust in institutions continues to decline, political movements on both extremes of the spectrum are gaining support. On the left, movements calling for sweeping economic reforms, including the redistribution of wealth, have become more mainstream. The rise of figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez demonstrates a growing willingness to embrace socialist policies such as universal health care and free college tuition. On the right, there is increasing support for authoritarianism and nationalist policies. Groups advocating for a return to a strongman leader like Donald Trump are growing in influence. They promise to restore order and protect American values from what they see as an encroaching liberal agenda. These movements are gaining ground because they offer simple solutions to complex problems and tap into the frustration felt by those who feel ignored by the political establishment. Both sides are calling for systemic change, but the growing polarization in the U.S. is leading to deepening divisions. As each side pushes for radical reforms, the country is becoming more and more fractured. The center is collapsing and the extremes are rising, signaling that the U.S. could be heading toward a political reckoning. If these trends continue, the United States could find itself on the brink of a crisis. The collapse of trust in institutions, combined with extreme inequality, radicalized political movements, and a government that fails to act, could lead to widespread civil unrest. We could see political violence escalate with organized groups on both sides clashing in the streets. Political assassinations, mass protests, and a breakdown of law and order are not far-fetched scenarios. In the worst-case scenario, the U.S. could face a prolonged period of political instability, with different regions of the country breaking away from federal control or a military intervention that imposes martial law. The possibility of a civil war, while unlikely, is not impossible given the deep divisions in American society. If the U.S. does not reform its political system, address inequality, and restore faith in institutions, the nation could face years of chaos and upheaval. The U.S. is repeating the same mistakes made by other empires in history. We are witnessing the same warning signs of collapse: extreme wealth inequality, government corruption, a disappearing middle class, and a loss of faith in institutions. History tells us how these stories end, with revolutions, breakdowns of order, and the rise of authoritarian regimes. The question is not whether it will happen, but when, and whether we can change course before it's too late. The warning signs are everywhere, and they cannot be ignored.